Hey everyone, so at long last I want to talk about John Brown, Abolitionist by David S. Reynolds. The subtitle to this book is The Man Who Killed Slavery, Sparked the Civil War, and Ceded Civil Rights, which is quite a bombastic subtitle, but he does a good job of backing it up. So John Brown, if you don't know who he is, was a 19th century abolitionist who is most well known for his raid on Harper's Ferry. It happened in 1859. What happened was Harper's Ferry was this federal arsenal which had a lot of weapons in it, and John Brown had this plan to raid the arsenal, take control of the arsenal, take control of the weapons there, and then incite a slave revolt there because it was in Virginia, a slave state, and then arm the slaves with the weapons he's just acquired, and then from there to hopefully cause a sort of cascade of more and more slave revolts throughout the South, which would then end slavery. And his plan too was to, once he armed his sort of mini army of freed black people, to take them into the mountains of West Virginia and kind of hide out and use guerrilla tactics and terrorize slave owners and basically sort of fight this war of attrition until slavery would end. And that was his plan. And famously, it did not work. Basically, what happened was the slaves who he tried to free weren't all that interested in participating, and then he was taken into custody by none other than Robert E. Lee and executed. And that had a huge impact after his death, which I'll talk about a little bit in a while. And so that's what we often learn about John Brown. But there was a lot more to his life. He was born in 1800, so he had almost 60 years of life to live. And he did a lot of things with it. He tried to start a community in North Elba, New York, which is in the Adirondacks near Lake Placid, which he wanted to be a sort of city on a hill where blacks and whites and Native Americans would sort of live in harmony and, be an exemplar of equality, be this sort of exemplar of what he thought America should be, essentially. And it wasn't all that successful, mostly because white people are racist, and but in addition to that, he was active in the Underground Railroad. Wherever he lived, he would help to get free slaves who had escaped to freedom, and in fact, at one point, he actually led a group of slaves personally north to Canada to freedom, and among many other things. But probably the second most famous incident that he's known for is the Massacre of Patawatomi, and this happened in Kansas, and it was during what's often called Bleeding Kansas, which was a period in the history of Kansas after 1854. Basically, what happened is in 1854, Kansas, which was not yet a state, the citizens of Kansas were told to vote on whether or not they wanted to enter the Union as a slave state or as a free state, and a bunch of people who were pro-slavery crossed the border from Missouri into Kansas and voted in that election in favor of slavery. And so because of all those extra votes, Kansas entered the Union as a slave state, even though the majority of people there were either abolitionists or at least not pro-slavery. And after that, basically a huge wave of violence erupted in Kansas between abolitionists and pro-slavery forces, especially those, as they're called, border ruffians from Missouri. And John Brown was heavily involved in that. For a while, he thought that was where the real, battle against slavery was centered, and so he went there, and at one point he and several other men basically just murdered several pro-slavery people and they murdered them basically because they were pro-slavery. And so it's probably the most condemnable thing that John Brown did, because those people hadn't necessarily done anything in particular. None of them were exactly slave owners. But that's probably the thing that he's second most well known for. But you probably know about John Brown, if you know something about him, is the Harper's Ferry raid, and that's often all we learn about him, and we often learn it without all that much context for why he did it and how he planned it and what his game plan was and the sort of history behind what he was doing. And so in terms of the motives for Harper's Ferry, John Brown was fervently anti-slavery, but also extremely pro-equality. Basically, he just believed he was just a believer in the equality of all races and all sexes. He believed in the equality of women. He treated his own children, whether or not they were male and female, equally. He did not sort of have women's work in his household and men's work in his household. He had all of his children share the work equally and invited women into his little movement to engage in Harper's Ferry. And he also was extremely critical of the treatment of Native Americans by the United States government and had several Native American friends throughout his life. He was also kind of ahead of his time in terms of his approach to disabled people and older people. Now in the 21st century we have this consciousness about ableism and ageism, and John Brown did not have patience for discriminating against people who were maybe older and disabled, and invited them into his movement as well, and said, well, if you're not fit enough to fight, then you can get food, get water, build houses, whatever. You can do the other things that we need for us. And so he was ahead of his time in many ways. And what I think is really interesting about him is that his extremely progressive, what we now call extremely progressive social ideas, were motivated by what was actually a very conservative brand of Puritanism, of Calvinism. He was a Calvinist in the sense of the Pilgrims, the people on the Mayflower. He believed that all humans were powerless before God, that everything was preordained, that that basically humans did not really have any kind of power in this world. And so he believed that because everyone's powerless before God, that therefore everyone is equal. And he also had an extremely fervent belief in the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And for him, the logical conclusion of the golden rule was that everyone is equal, that obviously if you want everyone else to treat you as you treat them, then you probably wouldn't be a racist or a sexist, and so on and so forth. And that's something that I find very interesting of him. And that really set him apart at the time. You wouldn't think that being sort of anti-racist and at least anti-racist, not anti-sexist and all these other things, you wouldn't think that would make him unique among abolitionists. You might rightly guess that it makes him unique among 19th century white people, but among abolitionists, you wouldn't think it would make him unique. And yet it did, because there were a lot of really racist abolitionists. A lot of abolitionists were part of the colonization movement, which was this idea that black people should be freed and then just shipped back to Africa. And some of these people thought this because they just believed blacks and whites just weren't compatible somehow culturally, and some of them believed it because they thought that black people were just inferior and shouldn't be allowed to stay here. And then a lot of people who were abolitionists but weren't necessarily racist were a lot more sort of compromising and moderate than John Brown. They kind of dragged their feet on the issue. They showed a willingness to compromise with the slave states, as probably manifested in the Kansas-Nebraska Act that allowed for the election in 1854 that ended up being rigged. And abolitionists like Abraham Lincoln, for example, believed that once slavery was ended, well, for one thing, Abraham Lincoln didn't actually want to end slavery in the places where it already existed. He just wanted to stop the spread of slavery. But when he did start to get more on the abolitionist bandwagon, he thought that once slaves were freed, that the slave owners who had been deprived of their labor should be compensated for that. And, it's like, black people are the ones who were treated like property for centuries, but yeah, let's compensate the white slave owners, and John Brown had no patience for this. And so that really sets him apart in the 19th century among abolitionists and among white people in general. And David Reynolds even says at one point that John Brown may have been one of the only non-racist white people in the 19th century, which might be going a little bit far, but, it's his words, not mine. And what also set him apart was that he walked the walk, to use the cliche, and didn't just talk the talk. So there were a lot of abolitionists who talked about freeing slaves, who, talked about equality and so on, but then would treat black people in incredibly racist ways in their own lives. And John Brown did not do that. Again, he tried to found a community with black people, with Native Americans in North Elba. But not only that, but he believed in the agency of black people in his plan for Harper's Ferry. His plan for Harper's Ferry, and this transitions too into the sort of context for Harper's Ferry, and this idea that it was sort of a crazed plan of a madman, which it wasn't. It has actually planned very extensively. He did a lot of fundraising for it. He gathered weapons for it. He had a group of people who he trusted to help him, and his group for Harper's Ferry included both white men and black men. And not only that, but it was actually inspired by black people. It was inspired by slave revolts. That not only slave revolts like the revolt led by Nat Turner in 1831, but also Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian Revolution in 1791, and also in Jamaica and Suriname, where there were these maroon communities, basically. And in Jamaica and Suriname, the way that these countries became free was that black slaves sort of revolted and then retreated into the mountains and into the wilderness and sort of used guerrilla tactics in this war of attrition where they would raid the white colonizers' farms and terrorize them and destroy property and kidnap people and sort of fight this war of attrition until finally the colonizers freed them. And John Brown took inspiration from these kinds of slave revolts because, especially those maroon communities, what his plan for Harper's Ferry was to do essentially the same thing, was to incite a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry and then retreat into the mountains of West Virginia and fight a guerrilla warfare from there against slave owners and to terrorize slave owners and slowly sort of try to pick away at their property, but also to get more and more black people to, join him, and that he thought would end slavery. And this plan was also based on the idea that the slaves would actually revolt. When he told this plan to a lot of his white friends, even Frederick Douglass didn't quite think it would work. A lot of people didn't have faith that black people would actually revolt, often for racist reasons, because they believed blacks to be less intelligent or, complacent and so on and so forth. But John Brown had full faith that they would. And of course, they didn't. The slaves that he tried to incite to revolt were quite reluctant. And that's often where the story of Harper's Ferry ends, right? It ends with that, and it ends with his execution. And we get no further comment. What you often don't learn is the fact that in the wake of the raid on Harper's Ferry, there was a wave of slave revolts across the South. And they weren't huge slave revolts, but still, they happened. And that's often what we don't learn, that it did inspire more slave revolts. That may not have accomplished that much, but it showed that he was an inspiration and that this was happening. So that's what John Brown is known for. And obviously he had a huge influence, and David Reynolds goes on at length about the influence that he had. But the most important impact that he had was that in the wake of the Harper's Ferry raid, there was this huge wave of fear in the South. The South was terrified of more slave revolts, and they were right to be afraid. They were afraid of Northern abolitionists, and in turn, Northern abolitionists started in the wake of John Brown's execution to take on his more radical ideas a little bit, and that was important as well. But in the South as well, there was a growth of secessionist sentiment, and this is something that's interesting too, is that the secession that happened after the election of Abraham Lincoln didn't come out of nowhere. There were secessionist politicians in the South for quite some time, and they had been there long before Harper's Ferry, and after Harper's Ferry, they suddenly found that they had way more support. And there was this huge buildup of weapons in the South by people who were, again, terrified of slave revolts and the possibility of the North invading. And so these two pieces, the South getting afraid and the North taking on more radical abolitionist ideas, were kind of the big influence that John Brown had. But he also had a more sort of diffuse influence. He was a big influence on civil rights leaders. He was an influence on people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, among many others. He was an influence on writers. So Langston Hughes, David Reynolds mentions, Langston Hughes has a poem about John Brown. County Cullen did. And white writers were so David Reynolds argues inspired by him. So in the wake of the Harper's Ferry raid, actually, Emily Dickinson began to show a great amount of experimentation in her poetry that had not occurred before, and he argues that is a sort of an indication that she took inspiration from his radical ideas to, have these radical ideas in her poetry. Walt Whitman, of course, wrote about John Brown. Even Herman Melville wrote stories inspired by John Brown, and so he had this great cultural influence as well. And so, yeah, this was just a fascinating book. Really, I just learned so much about so many things in this book. And there's a lot that I haven't talked about that I, wish I could, but it's just such a big subject. I will say, just at some quibbles that I have, is I think that sometimes David Reynolds is grasping for straws just a little bit, especially in the parts where he talks about, for example, the poetry of Emily Dickinson. I really liked the part about Emily Dickinson because I love her poetry, but it felt like when he tried to argue that Emily Dickinson's poetry was influenced by John Brown, that it was just a bit of a stretch, because there's really Emily Dickinson never really mentions John Brown in her poetry or in her letters. And so there's really no concrete evidence of what he says about how she may have been inspired by John Brown was actually true. And the same goes for his connection with Herman Melville and some other writers. And the way that he also kind of argues that the North may not have won the Civil War if it weren't for John Brown, because he argues that Union generals sort of started to take on more John Brown-like tactics, more violent, more uncompromising, more violent, more using terror to force the South into submission. Think of the campaign of William Tecumseh Sherman. And he also argues that Abraham Lincoln became ever more like John Brown because he became more of a fervent abolitionist and supported these war tactics. And I feel like that's, again, grasping for straws a bit, just because I think that those things could have easily been caused by other factors, by just how long the war drew on, and just William Tecumseh Sherman's personality, and maybe, And so to just look at people's behavior and say, oh, look, they're acting a bit more like John Brown, that must mean they were inspired by John Brown, is a stretch, I think. And lastly, I will just say that I think David Reynolds does veer in towards hagiography sometimes. John Brown did do some terrible things. There were innocent people that were killed in the Harper's Ferry raid. There was the Potawatomi massacre, which was largely against people who didn't necessarily have that much to do with slavery. And I don't think David Reynolds necessarily deals with that enough. And that's not to cancel out John Brown's admirable qualities, but I think that, we should look at him complexly. And David Reynolds' portrait is very complex and fascinating. So, again, this is a great, great book. I definitely recommend it, but I just have a couple of quibbles that I wanted to mention at the end. But anyway, I still recommend the book, absolutely. If you want to learn about John Brown, or about abolitionism, or about, racism, slavery, the causes of the Civil War, life in the 19th century, there's a lot in this book, and I recommend it. So anyway, if you've read this book, or if you're into John Brown, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to read this book, let me know your thoughts, or if you just have any thoughts about anything else I've said, just let me know. And I'll leave it at that, and talk to you all later.